Hello everyone, so welcome back to my English Law channel. So this talk is going to be more about exemption clauses. Last time on exemption clauses I particularly looked about how common law deals with exemption clauses. Now I'm going to concentrate on more the interplay between statute and exemption clauses. So here's a brief rundown of what this little talk is going to involve. We're going to look at types of contract, from B2B and B2C. We'll look at the difference between express and implied terms in these exemption clauses. We'll consider breaches of the contract, and then we'll try to categorize them. And lastly, look at various defenses. When are exemption clauses operative? When are they not? Considering whether an exemption clause is indeed incorporated into the relevant contract and how these things are construed. They often say construction in this case. Doesn't mean building. They mean interpretation of the clause, and more about the statutory controls right at the end. So remember, a B2B contract being business to business, two commercial entities trading with each other, selling goods or indeed services. And these are particularly governed by the Unfair Contract Terms Act 1977, known as the UCTA, or even people pronounce it UCTA occasionally as an acronym. And then B2C contracts, as in a business dealing with a consumer, an ordinary Joe, just any man or woman who's buying items or indeed hiring a service. So remember how statute affords greater protection to consumers based on the idea that regular people, they don't have much money usually, they don't know much about the law, and they need to be looked after. Whereas businesses, they're big enough to look after themselves. So the Consumer Rights Act 2015 particularly deals with this. I know there was the Unfair Terms and Consumer Contracts Act, which has been largely subsumed into the Consumer Rights Act 2015. And there was the Consumer Contracts Regulations, which is a European Union piece of legislation. Now, I know the United Kingdom has quit the European Union. However, all EU legislation remains on the statute book unless and until specifically repealed. Even Brexiteers would say they wouldn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, that not all EU legislation is unwise or unfair. So let's go back to UCTA 1977. What's the remit of the Act? Well, it's about exemption clauses and notices. So an exemption clause, as you might recall, it rules out liability for certain events, or sometimes just limits the liability, how much you'd have to pay. That says Section 13.1 of the Act is the very pertinent bit to this. And there's an important case about it, Stuart Gill against Horatio Meyer. So UCTA is mostly about the liability of businesses, as per Section 1.13. So it talks about liability for breach of obligations or duties arising from things done or to be done by a person in the course of business, from the occupation of premises used for business purposes. That's the end of the quotation. Now, when it says a person, it doesn't just mean a natural person, as in an individual. It could mean an entity, a big company, which could have legal personality. So there are also sections of the contract which are applicable to non-contractual notices in Section 2.1. So in order for UCTA to be pertinent to a contract, there's got to be something there seeking to exempt liability for negligence as per Section 2, or indeed seeking to exempt liability from the statutory implied terms as per Section 6, or perhaps trying to exempt liability from the contract when you're dealing on standard written terms, Section 13. Standard written terms is our contract. We always do this with business. We give the same contract to everybody. Okay, we might vary the item we're selling or the price or something, but the exemption of liability, that's always the same. We don't individually negotiate that. So UCTA comes into play. If it does come into play, if it is allowed, then there are two consequences of it. The first one is that some exemption of liability will be held to be void because of UCTA, and other terms will be held to be valid. However, they have to pass the reasonableness test. They'll be valid to the extent that they are reasonable, right? So the reasonable test applies to these clauses, and that's as per Section 11 of UCTA. So anyway, So which ones are void as per section 2.1 under UCTA? If you seek to exempt death, so liability for death or personal injury arising from negligence, that is void as per section 2.1 of UCTA. So even if someone assigns this clause, agrees to it, absolutely knows what he or she is agreeing to, understands it, and completely willingly consents to this, so what? Doesn't matter. That clause will not operate, it will be severed. The rest of the contract would still be held valid by the court, but that particular clause will not. You cannot exempt liability for death or personal injury if it arises from negligence. So here's what the Act says. A person cannot, by reference to any contract term or to a notice, exclude or restrict his liability for death and personal injury arising from negligence. Stop there. Notice, if the death or personal injury is not caused by negligence, that's a different matter. And notice that this clause also mentions limitation of liability. If you say, okay, we will pay out compensation, but only up to £10,000, no, that's a limitation of liability. That's not allowed either. So what's negligence as per section 1.1 of UCTA? It says breach of any obligation arising from express or implied terms of a contract to take a reasonable care or exercise reasonable skill. Close quotation. And that's much the same as you'd find in the Sale of Goods and Services Act, section 13. Okay, your reasonable care and skill, so trying to get it right, trying to be safe, taking whatever measures you would to ensure a person doesn't come to harm, in terms of, let's see, checking that the boat is seaworthy, or that the bungee jump rubbery string thing is actually intact, weighing the person properly before they go bungee jumping, for instance, issuing life jackets on a boat. These are all measures you could take to try to keep somebody safe. And remember, this is not perfect care and skill, it's not excellent care and skill, but it must be reasonable. If it falls below that reasonable standard, if it's bad, if it's below average, well, that would be less than reasonable. So it goes on to say, UCTA, breach of any common law duty to take reasonable care or exercise reasonable skill. So much the same standard you find in tort. So if you try to exempt liability in relation to implied terms, when that won't operate either. The implied term that the seller has a proper title to the goods, as in the rightful owner. So UCTA says liability for breach of obligations arising from section 13 of the Sale of Goods Act 1979 cannot be excluded or restricted by reference to any contract term. Close quotation. So supposing I've stolen whatever it is, okay, and I sell it on to you, and in the contract it says that I have got no liability about the title to this, and then it's found out that I'd stole it and you want to take legal action against me because that item's been confiscated, given back to the rightful owner. No, any term to say that I'm exempt from liability will not operate. Remember, there is no rightful ownership over stolen goods, even if you purchase them in good faith. Believing them, the seller, to be the rightful owner and not having any suspicion that he was not a rightful owner. So caveat emptor, buyer beware. You cannot pass on a better title than you have. If I don't have good title to the goods, then I can't give it to you, that good title to the goods. So looking more at the reasonable test here, as per section 2.2 of UCTA, exempting liability for loss or other injury arising from negligence. This is as per section 2.2 of UCTA. In the case of other loss or damage, a person cannot so exclude or restrict his liability for negligence except insofar as the term or notice satisfies the requirement of reasonableness. So we go back to our man of the Clapham Omnibus. What would a reasonable man believe in such a situation? Is this reasonable or not? So more about the reasonable test as per section 16(1)(a) of UCTA. So exempting liability for the breach of other statutory implied terms. It says liability for the breach of obligations arising from sections 13, 14 or 15 of the 1979 Act, the seller's implied undertakings as to conformity of the goods with description or sample or the quality or fitness for a particular purpose cannot be excluded or restricted by reference to a contract term except insofar as the term satisfies the requirement of reasonableness. Close quotation. So remember, they've got to conform to description. If I describe the goods as being whatever and I sell them, they must indeed answer to that description. They can't be significantly different. A sample, I give you a free sample. Oh, that's excellent quality. I give you the rest of it, but that's mediocre. Well, no, the sample didn't match the bulk. So quality, again, they have to be satisfactory quality, which, as I've often said, is not perfect, is not superb, but it cannot be bad. Okay, fitness for purpose, it's got to be something you can utilize for the reason you bought it. Like the Harrow car sales case, that was in effect not a car, it didn't have an engine. Harrow car sales spelled with a capital K in the Harrow car sales case, 1956, and car sales as a single word because it wasn't usable as a car. Okay, so go on to more about the reasonableness test. If you want to exempt liability for an express contractual term per Section 13, Section 3, Section 13 is only applicable where a party is dealing on standard written terms. If it's in individually negotiated terms, that's different. Then this Section 3 doesn't apply. Look at St Albans City Council against International Computers Limited, 1995, or Commercial Management Investments Limited against Mitchell Design and Construct Limited, 2016. So if these terms were negotiated by the parties, it wasn't the standard term they print off every single time, then Section 3 will be inapplicable. Now, but if you are dealing on standard written terms, a party cannot do certain things according to Section 3.2. He cannot exclude or limit his liability in relation to any breach of contract, and he can't say that he's entitled to perform the contract seriously different from what actually said in the terms, or indeed not perform at all. Because supposing you had a term saying we exclude all liability for underperformance, non-performance, substandard performance, well, no, that'd be ridiculous, so they might as well not have a contract at all, because you can either not provide any goods or services or provide dreadful goods and services. No, that wouldn't pass the any reasonableness test. If you're putting on your standard written terms. Okay. But if it is individually negotiated, should the party agree to this, and this is not what you print off every single time, is different, well, then that could operate. You're saying, well, a term to say, even if we don't provide goods and services that we said we would, or we provide them and they're terrible, you can't sue us. Okay, the reasonableness test, section 11.1. This is what the test is about. The term shall have been a fair and a reasonable one to have included having regard to the circumstances which were or ought reasonably to have been known or in the contemplation of the parties when the contract was made. So that's as per George Mitchell against Finney Lockseeds, 1983. So notice it's got that standard lawyer's term in this having regard to the circumstances, so the situation that they're in. This is what it was known or ought to have been known. So maybe a party didn't know it, but he should have known it. It would have been reasonable for him to know it if he'd kept his eyes and ears open, been reasonably vigilant. Okay, so we'll carry on more about how you apply this reasonableness test. The proferens, as in the person seeking to rely on the clause, has to demonstrate that it is reasonable as per section 11.5. It's up to him to prove it's reasonable. We don't simply assume it's reasonable. So when we're trying to decide whether it's reasonable or not, section 11.2 says it shall be had in particular to the matters specified in Schedule 2. So when deciding whether something is reasonable or not, we have to think of the reasonability of limitation clauses. The court will think about section 11.4, the resources that the proferens had in order to deal with the liability as per section 11.4. Could he provide these goods and services? Could he take all these reasonable steps or not? Because we don't want to impose a burden which is unduly onerous, so something which is impossible to fulfill. And could the proferens have taken out insurance as per section 11.4b? That was relevant in St Albans City Council against International Computers Limited, 1995. So the reasonable test in section 2, though there are certain guidelines, it said these are of general application to the requirement of reasonableness, and they came up in Stuart Gill against Horatio Meyer, 1992. So the guidelines say, A, the strength of the bargaining positions of the parties. Watford Electronics Limited against Sanderson CFL Limited 2001 is a pertinent case here, because if one party is very mighty, has a great bargaining position, the other one is very feeble, well, we can see that the weaker party had little real opportunity to insist on reasonableness for the other party, didn't have the wealth or whatever resources to meet a very high standard of reasonableness in anything he was providing. We've got to look at B, inducement. What was done to persuade people to agree to this? Was a very attractive contract financially or something? Notice, that's C, as in, was the other party told? Was it just in the small print, very hard to spot? Was it at the top in massive letters? Because the more your attention is drawn to it, then the more it's likely to be reasonable. D, condition precedents. Were there similar cases in which this was held to be reasonable? Because courts tend to go by that. Stare decisis, stand by the decision. So it's consistency. We need some predictability. Is this going to be allowed or not? And special orders. That's E. So anyway, so really that's just about everything. So thank you for watching my channel. Please watch my videos and book online lessons with me in law. I also do all sorts of other subjects: history, politics, French, religious studies, geography, citizenship. I help people writing essays and writing their CV, interview preparation. I'm a tour guide in Londinium. Toodaloo.